Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Kyiv will allocate $6.2 million for a drone interceptor program to defend the capital from Russian drone attacks, according to local city authorities' announcement. The move comes as President Volodymyr Zelensky urges allies for air defense support. Meanwhile, Ukraine's overnight drone attacks targeted Moscow and multiple Russian regions, killing one person and damaging an agricultural enterprise. According to media reports, while Russian Defense Ministry said air defenses downed 155 Ukrainian drones, including 11 heading for Moscow. South Korea, Japan, and the United States held a joint air drill with a US B-52H strategic bomber and allied fighter jets over international waters to deter North Korea's nuclear threats, according to media reports. The three nations' defense chiefs also met in Seoul, stressing trilateral cooperation. Germany plans to buy 15 additional US-made F-35 fighter jets, bringing its planned fleet to 50, amid NATO's push to boost defense spending to 5% of GDP. Politico has reported the move comes as Germany prepares to replace 85 aging Tornado jets. Dozens of Kurdistan Workers' Party, as known as PKK militants, will hand over their weapons in a ceremony in Suleimania, Iraq today, marking the first step in disbanding the group after a call by imprisoned leader Abdullah Öcalan, according to media reports. UK GDP fell 0.1% in May after a 0.3% drop in April, marking a second consecutive month of contraction as industry and construction declines offset services growth. The Finance Minister Rachel Reeves called the data disappointing amid rising concerns over the government's economic outlook. US President Donald Trump said the United States will supply weapons to Ukraine through NATO and plans a major statement on Russia on upcoming Monday. This comes as Trump voiced frustration with Russian President Vladimir Putin and as Rome conference pledged $12 billion for Ukraine's reconstruction. Nigerian Foreign Minister Yusuf Tugar says the U.S. is pressuring African nations to accept Venezuelan deportees, including former prisoners, but Nigeria will not comply due to its own challenges. According to media reports, U.S. has raised the request with 5 African leaders during the White House talks this week. White House has yet to comment. According to the Russian state media, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is visiting Pyongyang this weekend for a new round of strategic talks. This comes as North Korea prepares to send an additional 25,000 to 30,000 soldiers to aid Russia's expanded offensive. Satellite images show troop movements and supply flights between the two states, while reports suggest North Korean troops are already fighting alongside Russian forces. According to Western officials, thousands have been killed or wounded so far. Lavrov is expected to meet his North Korean counterpart and possibly Kim Jong-un, signaling a military alliance that could reshape security in Europe and Asia. This comes as Lavrov says he outlines Putin's position on settling the Ukraine war in a meeting with top U.S. diplomat Marco Rubio on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Malaysia. Let's listen in to what the Russian foreign minister had to say in the summit.
Я хочу ответить словами Дональда Трампа. Так я вам и скажу. И ждите больших сюрпризов, он сказал. Ну, я не знаю насчет больших сюрпризов, но сами понимаете, если вы же знакомы с дипломатической деятельностью, вы нас часто сопровождаете. Есть вещи, которые не комментируются. Да, мы обсуждали Украину, мы подтвердили ту позицию, которую президент Путин излагал, и в том числе в очередной раз 3 июля в разговоре с президентом Трампом.
Now we are joined by Andrew K.P. Long. He's a China strategist joining us live from London. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us today. Good to see you. How credible are the reports of North Korean troops fighting alongside Russian forces, and what could this mean for the dynamics of the conflict in Ukraine, according to you?
Well, there are many reports, together with films and photographs of showing North Korean soldiers fighting alongside the Russians over Ukraine. This reflects a strategic shift of the North Koreans towards forming a closer alliance with Russia against American aggression. Because trace back a little of how the United States wants to suppress North Korea's sovereignty and internal security. Think about Trump 1.0, when President Trump stepped over the border into North Korea and shook hands with Kim. It's all for show, because that was culminated after a series of talks, the so-called six-party talks, which even preceded President Trump's first presidency, with the so-called six parties, including a number of European countries and also China, and brokering a deal. But then the United States strategy is always wants the North Korea to surrender everything first before they even consider granting some of the concessions, for example, easing the economic sanctions, strangleholding North Korea's economy. So the North Koreans say, well, this is not the way to negotiate. How can I surrender everything? And then, begging for mercy, that kind of crumbs from the table, so that seeking an insurance, a nuclear insurance first of all, developing their own nuclear weapons. And then they took this leave from China's Chairman Mao's book. Trace back the time when Chairman Mao first founded the People's Republic of China, when China was extremely poor. After years of war and internal conflict, and China eventually stood up with a very, very poor country. At that time, China broke off relations with Russia. Russia, because there was a conflict of views on how the communist movement should be advanced around the world, and that both leaders did not agree eventually, and Russia withdrew all the technical experts from China and even threatened China with nuclear weapons at that time. So the choice for Chairman Mao was between developing its economy and developing its nuclear weapons. In terms of China's terminology, it's a choice between 和止 means nuclear power, 裤子 means trousers, because China was so poor that several families had to share a pair of trousers. So Chairman Mao chose the bomb instead of developing the economy first of all. So eventually, China stood up and with its own nuclear bomb and maintained its own security. The North Koreans is trying to take a leaf out of China's Chairman Mao's book. And then, of course, that was not enough, because nowadays it's not just whether we have one or two bombs, because the Americans can send in the bombers and obliterate everything, as they try to do in Iran. So the North Koreans are trying to develop its long-range missiles with nuclear-capable warheads, and it's also allying with Russia now. So in return for Russian technology, missile technology to develop its long-range weapons, the North Koreans are sending soldiers over to fight alongside Russia. And of course, for Russia, the Ukraine campaign is extremely important, because that President Putin had put a lot of his political capital on the campaign. And now, because the Trump's recalibrating its strategy and trying to extract itself from Ukraine, even trying to negotiate a peace behind the back of European allies. So Putin saw this, but another latest development is that Europeans, they are fearful of the very resurgent Russia, and they are more united in supplying weapons to Ukraine. So the Ukraine war is carrying on, and Russia is running out of soldiers. And of course, the Ukrainians are running out of soldiers even more. And hence, the help from North Korean soldiers fighting alongside Russia became important and strategic, considering all the complex dynamics I've outlined.
And Andrew, now looking at bigger picture, what does the implication or what does this timing suggest about Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visiting Pyongyang amid ongoing talks about ongoing also the drills that took place yesterday in Taiwan and then today in between South Korea, Japan, and U.S.?
Yes, you highlighted the hot points. First of all, the timing is important in the sense that it came after the bombing by United States of the Ukrainian nuclear facilities, sending the bombers all the way from the United States, stealth bombers, kind of bunker-busted bombers with dubious results. But then it also exposed the kind of security risk in terms of how you're going to withstand this kind of bombardment, long-distance bombardment. And air defenses is very important. And air defenses depend on modern missile technology, communication systems. So Russia is much more better placed to supply the North Koreans with air defenses. The second dimension is, of course, the forming a closer military alliance between South Korea and Japan. There is a China perspective as part of the China containment strategy in Asia-Pacific, including the Quad with India and also Australia, the nuclear power submarines, and also the first island chain center in Okinawa, second island chain center in Guam, and forming a closer military cooperation between Japan and South Korea, and even deploying anti-aircraft missiles or anti-air missiles in South Korea, the so-called THAAD missiles. But for North Korea, if the U.S. hostile forces gains dominance in that area, that would threaten the security of North Korea, because the alliance with anti-Western forces, including China, is important. And hence, the visit of the Lavrov could supply not only the air defenses, but also how to strengthen the cooperation with the Russians in the Asia-Pacific area. That is also a response to so-called bringing the NATO influence to the Asia-Pacific. So if NATO forces are brought into the Pacific, the counterbalance would be to bring the Russian influence, military influence, into the Asia-Pacific to counter this kind of coercion with a Western-led, American-led NATO forces, or with Americans allies with Japan and Australia in the Asia-Pacific. And that would, of course, affect the security of North Korea.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for sharing that insight. You will stay with us as we stay on the topic. 9 people have been injured in Kharkiv as a result of a Russian strike, according to the State Emergency Service of Ukraine. Russian drones strike Kharkiv's Saltivka district, damaging several buildings in the attack. Mayor Ihor Terekhov has said that A maternity hospital was also hit by the blasts and is now being evacuated. This comes after Russia's defense ministry said that its forces had struck Ukrainian military airfields and facilities, while Ukraine said that Russia launched a new round of airstrikes on Kyiv and other places. The Russian army reportedly also repelled multiple attacks by the Ukrainian army in Kharkiv, Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, and other directions, and launched several offensives, destroying a large amount of military equipment of the Ukrainian army. Now we're joined by Joshua Barnes. He's my colleague at NewsX World. Joshua, what more can you tell us about the ongoing Ukraine and Russia's war?
Well, yes, Suma, further strikes reported by Ukraine. This is the third night of drone assaults, which have caused damage, deaths and injuries across the country in recent days. The situation seemingly is intensifying, with Russian attacks continuing, and it has drawn questions from the wider geopolitical world and leaders looking at the ongoing situation. Of course, the context: there have been discussions and pushes for peace between Russia and Ukraine. Several Western nations pushing for a 30-day ceasefire, with direct discussions between Russia and Ukraine taking place for the first time in over 3 years. A second round of those talks, both of them taking place in Istanbul, led to prisoner swaps, but ultimately very little in terms of moving towards peace. The US intervention is an important topic in this story. Donald Trump has been further aligned with Russia, has spoken with Vladimir Putin. His envoy, Steve Witkoff, has met Putin on multiple different occasions, as, of course, the US looked to try and get a peace deal sorted. It was one of Trump's key points during his election campaign, saying that the war between Russia and Ukraine would be ended within days if he came into office. That has not played out, but the US is continuing their efforts to work towards peace. Questions have been raised about US support for Ukraine, something that the Biden administration were very strong on. Trump has momentarily paused aid at different points, but he is now potentially looking at providing more support. In the backdrop of conversations between Lavrov and Marco Rubio, Lavrov, of course, as you've mentioned already, Russian Foreign Minister, and Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State, we expect more discussions have been had there and pressure potentially being put on. But Trump's rhetoric has changed towards Russia in the face of these continued strikes reported by Ukraine. He persistently says that Putin is continuing to kill people, continuing to call for that ceasefire. It's something we will keep an eye on, but moving forward, it seems that peace is further away and continued strikes are ongoing.
Thank you, Joshua, for sharing that insight. Now we move on to our next news. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he hopes to reach a truce deal in the next few days to secure the release of more Israeli hostages still held by Hamas. This comes as the UN confirms the first delivery of fuel into the Gaza Strip in 130 days, about 75,000 liters, but warns that it's nowhere near enough to sustain vital humanitarian operations. UN officials say fuel shortages could cut off clean drinking water for tens of thousands of children and raise the risk of deadly diseases. Meanwhile, Doctors Without Borders says it has been forced to evacuate a clinic in southern Gaza as Israeli troops advance into western Khan Yunis, pushing displaced civilians closer to the sea. And in the occupied West Bank, an Israeli soldier was killed in a stabbing and shooting attack in Gush Etzion on Thursday. Israel's military chief, Eyal Zamir, visited the scene, calling it a grave terror incident and vowing to intensify counter-terrorism operations. Now we go back to Joshua Barnes. He's an anchor and correspondent. Joshua, what more can you tell us about the ongoing situation in Gaza and related to Gaza?
Well, yes, Suma, it is similar rhetoric to what I've just spoken about in the Russia-Ukraine war, not going on for as long. Of course, started with Hamas's 7th of October attacks on Israel, with thousands killed and hundreds of hostages taken. Following that Israeli offensive, have been strong. A brief pause in between at the start of this year after a ceasefire was agreed, with hostage exchanges also agreed. But since that deal broke down, further fighting has resumed and Israeli attacks have intensified. The situation is a complex one. Talks over a potential ceasefire deal have been ongoing. Several rounds of talks indirect with mediators including the United States, Qatar and also Egypt. It seems like there was some more optimism at the start of this week. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister in the United States, of course the situation in Gaza, the hostages and the ongoing war and civilian issues, a key point of contention and a key talking point. But it seems that there are still several gaps in a potential ceasefire deal. Israel want Hamas disbanded so they can't launch another attack like the October 7th. They want to make sure that Hamas are also disarmed, and then the return of all hostages, around 50 dead and alive, still being held by the group in Gaza. On the flip side, Hamas want a direct end to the war and a complete withdrawal of Israeli troops. Both sides are very strong on these points, and finding a middle ground has been difficult. There have been glimmers of hope. Hamas have spoken about agreeing to a partial hostage release, with 10 being released in that initial stage in exchange for Palestinian prisoners being held in Israel. But again, the rhetoric we've heard from Benjamin Netanyahu, very similar, some optimism, some hope, but we know on the ground in Doha and in these meetings we've heard from several officials, there are still gaps that need to be bridged.
And Joshua, can you tell us more about the Doctors Without Borders that they have said that they have been asked to evacuate?
Asuma, this situation is highlighting the humanitarian crises that many organisations are reporting within the Gaza enclave. Journalism access is very limited, but NGOs and charities are working within the region. Now, these evacuation orders we have seen consistently. This is Israel basically saying that civilians and groups need to leave certain areas before strikes are carried out. Israel say this is targeting Hamas, who are still operating within the country, but of course the impact on people that are ill, that have been injured in these strikes, also impact on stuff like aid, a huge point of contention, and it has seen a wider global condemnation than other issues. The question around aid, medical care, with hospitals also out of action. The situation on the ground, according to many charities, is extremely difficult. Though aid has resumed in some capacity, there are still reports of killings around aid centres from Israel on civilians. Also reports as well of limited aid getting in. But this, of course, is a point of contention that Israel disagree with. They say that a lot of aid is moving into the country now, and the way that it is being brought in is done by a US-backed group called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and this is to try and stop the aid getting into the hands of Hamas, which Israel do not want. They do not want Hamas to use the aid, not just to, of course, look after the group and keep them ready to carry on fighting, but also to be used as a way of generating money to then sell it at an exorbitant price to the people living in Gaza. An extremely difficult situation, lots of questions raised about the humanitarian situation within Gaza, deaths reported on a regular basis. Ultimately, diplomacy could be the way to end that, and as discussed, there's still some way to go.
Thank you, Joshua Barnes. Now we move on to our next news. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi Friday on the sidelines of ASEAN talks in Malaysia today amid soaring tensions over U.S. tariffs. The U.S. Secretary of State called the talks constructive and positive. He further stressed the need for relations and communication between U.S. and China. It's their first meeting since President Trump returned to office, with Washington threatening tariffs up to 50% on over 20 countries. Many in Asia, Rubio assured partners the U.S. won't abandon the Asia-Pacific and said tariff negotiations may yield better rates. Wang slammed the tariffs as a blow to free trade. Both sides also touched on Taiwan and the South China Sea, with Rubio raising security concerns and Wang warning against U.S. provocation. Now we are joined back by our guest Andrew K.P. Long. He's a China strategist. Thank you, Andrew, for staying with us. What were the key takeaways, or what are the significant developments from the meeting between U.S. Secretary Marco Rubio and the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi from this summit?
Well, there are two major issues involved here. First of all is the tariff war, which United States imposed on everybody, especially on China. The second one is the regional security involving Taiwan. Now, as far as the first question is concerned, I think that the both leaders agree on some modus operandi in Geneva, saying that both sides should de-escalate and work on a mutually acceptable solution. But these are broad principles. But there is a divergence in approach. The United States always wants to impose its will on everybody for the result which can perceive with a definite win. Whereas the China philosophy is not so much very helpful. Talk about win and loss. It's a kind of win-win, possible win-win situation. In other words, both sides should accommodate each other's key interests. But the word accommodation almost doesn't exist in President Trump's dictionary. It's always one American first and everything. So on one hand, it's hyping all these tariffs. Don't forget, it's only a matter of words. I mean, the President Trump can raise the tariffs to 200%, 300%. It's just a verbal kind of assertion. And then for that, he wants concessions. And the concessions are real for China. It was impinging on China's security interests and the development rights. So I think that China wants a total package. In other words, you just can't pick on one side and say, well, I'm going to lower the tariffs on this one, and then you open up the rare earths supply. Whereas the rare earths is China's trump card. It's really the Achilles heel of the United States, because the rare earths is central to not only cars, but the weaponry, including F-35 fighters and the military-industrial complex. So I think that China wants a total holistic package, and we're not there yet. And then Rubio's meeting is just to walk through some of the items. Yes, China, of course, is open to talks, and the Rubio portrays this as positive. No doubt China wants a positive outcome, but then the real meat is not there yet. And that depends on the eventual relaxation of restrictions of China's access to semiconductors, the kind of scaling down the kind of high Chinese hostility, trying to impose restrictions or sanctions on many countries trying to trade with China, trying to demarcate or trying to split the whole world supply value chain so as to contain China. So the whole picture must be clear to Beijing before a deal can be reached. And China is the only country that's able to have the stranglehold over Americans' Achilles heel, and that's the rare earths.
And Andrew, now given Rubio's assurances to Asian ASEAN countries that the U.S. will not abandon the Asia-Pacific, do you think how reliable is this statement towards ASEAN countries? How are ASEAN countries, or how should ASEAN countries react to this statement?
Of course, the Asia-Pacific is very important to the United States and the Trump administration, because that's the theater where the United States can strengthen its containment of China. And the Asia theater includes, of course, the security in the South China Sea, over Taiwan, and the United States wants to rally its semi-allies in South Korea, and also the allies in Japan and Philippines, and of course Australia with the hawkers, and the first island chain, second island chain with American assets to contain China. So I think there's there. But the question is that what are the Asian countries, particularly those outside this close military alliance of Philippines and Japan, for example, Malaysia was trying to get out of it, or for that matter, Singapore and Indonesia, because they don't want to be dragged into this potential conflict. There's nothing in for them. Their biggest trading partner is China. They want peace. They want to make. They're good friends with the United States. They also maintain good friendship with China. So by dragging them into this kind of war game, has got no positive benefit to these countries. But of course, when Malaysia is hosting this visit, the Malaysians would not sort of hype up this issue. They want to be polite to the Rubio, and they want to try to accommodate the Americans' interests. But at the end of the day, it's the national security that is important to countries like Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, who wants a more balanced relationship between the United States and China.
Thank you very much.
As far as Taiwan is concerned, now again, Taiwan, there is no strategy for Beijing to immediately take over Taiwan. Of course, the deadline is the latest is 2049, which is 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. But then the absolute priority is for peaceful unification, and that's embodied in 3 serial white papers issued by Beijing over the past decade, all focusing on peaceful unification. Now, how is that going to happen? Because most of the Taiwanese people do not want immediate unification, but they also do not want to confront China. They know that at the end it's going to end badly for the Taiwanese people. So they do not want to declare independence. But however, the current leader, has a separatist tendencies. And then the United States, of course, recognized the one China policy, but only so much in words, but in substance, is trying to boost up the separatist tendencies by supplying arms to Taiwan, by deploying all these anti-China military alliance over the South China Sea, the freedom of navigation, so-called freedom of navigation, and also promoting this kind of separate identity of Taiwan, trying to split the two peoples together. Now, Taiwan has always been, if you look at history, part of China dating back to the Ming Dynasty. And the Ming Dynasty even had the administration there in Taiwan. But then the two people belong to the same culture, and then recently the people-to-people interaction has been increasing. There are over, at the height of the period, maybe 1 million Taiwanese people. Now it's down to maybe 300,000 Taiwanese people living on the mainland, together with their families and working on their businesses. And then, of course, the Taiwanese artists and filmmakers and also young people, they're going to the mainland to establish their businesses. And then likewise, the tourists visiting on both sides. Yes, the system is different, but it's not the end of the day. If you go to Shanghai, if you go to Beijing, go to the big cities or even to the small cities, the lifestyle is not that much different. Of course, the politics are different, but it's not the end of the world. So I think in due course, with more and more people-to-people exchanges, the possibility of peaceful unification still exists. And that's Beijing's preference, because Beijing sees clearly this kind of rhetoric about taking over Taiwan is a trap, because taking Taiwan is not that easy militarily, apart from the fact that Chinese people do not want to hurt themselves. They belong to the same race. So yes. I think that there's a false rhetoric, and Beijing can see through it very clearly. But unfortunately, most of the international media doesn't still being hyped up by this kind of Taiwan story.
Thank you very much, Andrew K.P. Long, for joining us today and sharing your insight throughout our news. Now we move on to our next news. Malaysia's foreign minister has said that the Southeast Asian bloc ASEAN has agreed that an election in Myanmar was not a priority and is urging the country's ruling junta to adhere to its peace commitments instead. Myanmar, an ASEAN member, is in the grips of an escalating civil war, and critics have derided the junta's planned election this year as an attempt to prolong military rule through proxies in the absence of a viable political opposition. Minister Mohammed Hassan said members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which Malaysia is chairing, want Myanmar to honor a 5-point consensus peace plan its junta agreed in 2021, months after a coup against Aung San Suu Kyi's civilian government. The peace plan has largely been a failure, with the military government unwilling to engage in dialogue with opponents it views as terrorists. Opposition political parties have been decimated, and what remains of them are either barred from or unwilling to contest the election. Myanmar's military is battling to contain a widening rebellion by ethnic minority rebel armies and a resistance movement that mushroomed quickly after a lethal crackdown on pro-democracy demonstrations. At least 3.5 million people have been displaced, according to the United Nations. ASEAN also wants a temporary ceasefire announced by the junta after a devastating earthquake in March to be extended and expanded, as per Malaysia's Foreign Minister Mohammed Hassan. Now we're joined by Ambassador Suresh Goyal. He's a former diplomat joining us live from New Delhi. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World.
Thank you.
Thank you. Why has ASEAN, under Malaysia's chairmanship, decided this decision that holding elections in Myanmar is not a priority at this particular time?
Well, in terms of the real politics and the situation on ground in Myanmar, I think they've taken a practical decision on this score, really. As we see the situation at present in Myanmar, there are two things. Firstly, junta is quite firmly entrenched in Naypyidaw, basically. Most of the movement for democracy, or most of the movement for change of the government, really has lost steam by now. And unless there are new political forces, there are new political ideas, it is very unlikely that there would be parties in the elections which would be able to take on the junta. That is number one. Number two, if you look at the political matrix of Myanmar, Myanmar is facing the rebellion on the west, on the eastern areas, on the north, with the bordering areas with China. Kaching is one area where, in fact, there is still a whole lot of resistance from the rebels. China is firmly on the side of the junta, to the extent that they're even prepared to let go of the rare earths from Kaching to keep supporting the junta. So in that sense, there does not appear to be any great benefit of holding the elections until junta has essentially opened up the political field, giving voice to the other parties and the other opinion. Now that is something which they have not implemented, and as the time goes by, it seems difficult. Therefore, I think if ASEAN had put in the statement something to the effect of junta opening up the political field in Myanmar, it would have been a welcome statement. But by calling for the implementation of the peace 5-point plan, they're essentially calling for the same thing, but not so clearly. Yeah.
And Ambassador, what are the obstacles or main obstacles preventing Myanmar's military junta from adhering to these 5-point consensus, according to you?
I don't think they want to implement the 5-point consensus simply because they are quite comfortable in the capital as they are. They hold all the strings of the power. If they were to actually implement the 5-point consensus, they would be basically opening up to participation of other political ideas in Myanmar. So I don't think they really want to implement it. And in that process, uh, if I could say so, there is no great pressure on them to implement that consensus. So it's a comfortable situation as far as they are concerned.
Thank
Yes,
you, Ambassador.
Asoma.
Thank you, Ambassador Suresh, for sharing that. You will stay with us as we stay in the region. South Korea, Japan, and the United States have conducted a joint air drill involving a US B-52 strategic bomber and fighter jets of the three allies over international waters, according to the South Korean Defense Ministry. It was the first time this year that a US B-52H strategic bomber was deployed to the Korean peninsula for a drill. As per the Defense Ministry, the drill was conducted to improve deterrence against North Korea's increasing nuclear and missile threats. The drills came as the three countries' defense chiefs held an annual meeting in Seoul where they recognized the importance of close trilateral cooperation in addressing security challenges posed by North Korea in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. The three countries have reportedly boosted security cooperation in recent years as tensions have increased stemming from North Korea's military developments and Pyongyang's deepening military ties with Russia. Now we go back to our guest, Ambassador Suresh Goyal. He's a formal diplomat joining us live from New Delhi. Thank you, Ambassador, for staying with us. Now, what is the strategic significance of this drill and the timing of this drill, according to you?
Well, the drill is a clear. You see, after Trump became president, there have been a feeling in Indo-Pacific region, and particularly in the South China Seas and the Japanese high seas, that Trump may not be so interested in essentially extending military support or strategic support to its allies in the region, that the USA want to end all these conflicts. Trump is not interested in supporting them, and therefore, as far as South China Seas is concerned or Indo-Pacific is concerned, that presence or that kind of a, action by USA may go down. I think this message has gone clearly that USA will continue to be engaged in the region for the simple reason that both Russian Federation and China are a major competitor for influence in the area. North Korea is working both with Russia as well as China in terms of encouraging their role, promoting their role in the region, which can actually jeopardize USA's military alliance or USA's partnership with both South Korea and Japan. And if anything happens there in terms of the security situation in these two countries to the detriment of the USA, that would be considered to be a win for China, which USA cannot allow it to happen really. So I think it's a message to say that, to convey to the world that USA continues to be engaged in the area and that there will be a limit to Chinese role or Chinese expansionism in this area. Russia is not so much, I think, because Russia has its own problems to handle in Ukraine. So Russia, I don't think, will be such a problem as far as US is concerned. But China is the issue here, and USA will have to continue to really deal with China because of Taiwan, because of South Korea and because of Japan. Yes.
Thank you, Ambassador Suresh Goyal, for sharing that insight. You will stay with us. Now we move on to our next news. In Iraq's Kurdistan region, 30 Kurdish PKK fighters have burned their weapons at a symbolic ceremony, making the start of a historic disarmament process. The move aims to end a decades-long conflict that has claimed more than 40,000 lives. An AFP correspondent on the ground confirmed that fighters torched their arms as part of the deal. But tensions remain high just hours before the ceremony. Authorities say 2 drones were shot down overnight near Peshmerga bases. 1 drone was destroyed above the 70th unit in Suleimania late Thursday night, and another explosive-laden drone was intercepted early Friday near Altyn Kupri in Kirkuk province. No casualties were reported, but the incidents underscored the security challenges as the PKK takes its first formal steps towards disarmament in Iraq's autonomous Kurdistan region. Now we move on to our next news. Beijing has denied claims of asking firms to illegally collecting and store users' personal information. This comes after an Irish regulator helping in European Union regulate data privacy began in investigating China's social media giant TikTok. The social media giant has been in the crosshairs of Western governments for years over fears that personal data could be used by China for espionage or propaganda purposes. However, TikTok has insisted that it has never received any requests from Chinese authorities for European users' data. TikTok was fined $620 million in May by the Data Protection Commission over sending personal data to China. Although the Chinese social media giant had insisted this data was only accessed remotely. Let's in fact listen in to what Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning had to say.
具体问题呢，建议你向中方的主管部门询问。我可以告诉你的是，中国政府高度重视并依法保护数据隐私和安全，从来没有也不会要求企业或个人以违法的形式采集或存储数据。我们希望欧方切实尊重市场经济和公平竞争原则，为各国企业提供公平、公正和非歧视的营商环境。
Now we go back to our guest discussion with Ambassador Suresh Goyal. Thank you, Ambassador, for staying with us. Now, what are the main concerns raised by European regulators regarding TikTok's handling of user data and potential links to Chinese authorities?
You see, this remains a very murky kind of a situation where denials by the company do not seem to really convince anyone that what they are saying is not being done is actually true. The fact is that once you have your servers, you have all your database in China, to which the Chinese government has access, and under the law, Chinese government will be able to access anything stored on the servers at any time without any questioning or any resistance by TikTok. So till that data continues to be stored on servers in China and TikTok continues to be a Chinese company which remains under the jurisdiction of China, any kind of a denial remains rather weak unless there are very convincing kind of arguments given or processes explained which can convince the world that it is indeed not being done. You see, the fact is that in these days, the information or the data is gold really. And once a government has the data about all kinds of things, the personal affairs of key people, and many key people use TikTok for communication or for conveying the ideas. If it has personal information about the users, how are they behaving, their social behavior, their economic compulsions and the priorities, it can become really a very, very powerful tool in the hands of China. And therefore, to me personally, the argument by TikTok that no, this information or the Chinese government has never requested such information or the TikTok has never been required to share this information with China does not hold water. In the past, there have been instances when China has used information. In fact, the very reason that high technology items, even to the extent of mobiles and the chips, and when the questions are raised about using the technology from China, because there is always a doubt that in any equipment being from China could have been manipulated to gather information from the other country. Therefore, I really would look at this with a pinch of salt and be careful and take out proper action that personal data does not in any fashion go to TikTok or the country where they're actually hosted.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Suresh Goyal, for joining us. Thank you and sharing your insight throughout our news. Now we move on to our next news. Pakistan's restive Southwest authorities have recovered the bullet-ridden bodies of 9 kidnapped bus passengers from the mountains of Balochistan. Officials say armed men intercepted 2 buses on Thursday evening, seizing passengers believed to be laborers from Punjab. Their bodies were found overnight riddled with bullets. No group has claimed responsibility, but the region has long been a hotbed for Baloch separatists who accuse the government of plundering local resources to fund projects in the Punjab. The Baloch Liberation Army, the most active insurgent group, has intensified attacks in recent months, mostly targeting security forces and Chinese investments, including the port of Gwadar. The Pakistani army statement blamed India for backing the militants, saying New Delhi is using proxies to destabilize the region. India has denied those charges. The killings come just months after the BLA's deadly March attack that left 31 dead and over 400 train passengers held hostage. With China pouring billions into Balochistan, tensions and violence are rising. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.